Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Welcome to this episode of the Growth Hike podcast. Today, I have Sophie Lee with me, and we are talking brand storytelling. Sophie is an experienced marketer, founder of Electric Peach. They work with purpose driven businesses and help them craft their story and deliver their message in an impactful and memorable way. She always brings lots of energy, color, and positive vibes into the conversation. Welcome, Sophie.
Hi, Martin. Thank you so much for having me. And hi, everyone watching.
Good to have you here today. Let's talk storytelling. Why storytelling? Why brands and everyone should use storytelling?
Storytelling is the most impactful communication tool that brands have at their disposal. It's literally the reason why human beings or Homo sapiens have evolved to the point that we have. Way back when, at the beginning of time for humans, when we were existing around other Homo species, Homo sapiens were not the cleverest. They didn't have the best tools. They weren't the strongest. But we managed to evolve beyond the other species because of our ability to communicate outside of our tribes. And one of the ways that we did that was through storytelling, which is why throughout history, there are stories on caves, there's stories on papyrus, there's stories everywhere we look throughout the entirety of human history. So they are the most effective way of communicating sometimes complex concepts, bridging the gaps between different people, different cultural understandings. They humanize brands, they bridge confusion between things. And also, most importantly, they're extremely memorable. So when you're giving just facts and figures, if you use the context of a story to put across that information, it's more likely that your audience will resonate with it and that they will remember it, which obviously then helps you to spread that information wider, as our ancestors, our Homo sapien ancestors, did themselves.
Great. We can remember stories. That's an easy way to remember and comprehend what's being said. Now, how this would benefit businesses specifically?
Well, if we imagine how noisy the world is, and there are billions and billions of pieces of information flying around the internet at any given time, businesses need to stand out from all of that noise. And they need to resonate with their audiences in a way that the audience hasn't already seen. Because most of us are now quite snowblind to marketing messages, to the same language being used over and over again, to innovative or solutions driven or whatever marketing spiel that businesses use over and over. Our brain literally doesn't comprehend it anymore. It's like white noise. So when we use storytelling and we create a narrative, we bring in characters that are relatable, we have a moment of crises and then a resolution, we are able to connect beyond all of the noise with our audiences and invite them in. And as I said before, it's memorable, but most importantly, in the internet world of noise, it stands out from everything else that's being put out there by other businesses.
Standing out and being remembered.
Yeah, the two most important things that you want from your marketing messages. And also, so that's the sort of initial point is you're standing out, you're getting people's attention, but then you're also creating an emotional connection with them that gets them to want to know more about your business. And then they start to learn more about your business. And then you've moved them from the engage into the connect. And then you can get to know them better, build that relationship, and then you move them through to actually buying from you.
Okay, most of the purchases today are most purchase people use emotion when they're purchasing.
Exactly. I think that's probably always been the case. Human beings are emotion driven creatures. as much as we like to think that we're rational and that we make decisions rationally, it's totally untrue. And to you, audience, think about times when you have purchased something just because you don't really know why. If you were to go back and think, oh, I just didn't really think about that, I just purchased that thing, it's because the message around it had resonated with you on an emotional level and had spoken to a problem that you maybe know or don't even know that you have, and made you believe that they're going to give you the solution to that problem. And that's really about the power of communication in the psychology of humans. It's how we relate to one another. And businesses, when, or brands, when they use that well, it's the difference between massive growth or just sort of stagnating or maybe even failing in business.
You mentioned psychology there. That's all very interesting. You mentioned psychology there. And what can you tell us how storytelling works? What in more like how the mechanics of that work? How do you trigger that emotion in humans so what we are telling there can resonate with us?
So, just a bit of neuroscience for you, because this is like one of my favorite parts of storytelling, is it literally electrifies the brain. So if you were to look at your brain in an MRI scan when you're, or a CT scan when you're being told a story, it's basically like your neurons in your brain light up in different ways. So they've been able to tell from through looking at brain imagery what happens in the brain when you're being told a story. And it releases cortisol when you're having the crisis moment in a story. And that gets you gripped, that gets you really like paying attention. And then when you have the resolution of the story, you release feel good hormones, dopamine. But the thing that I love the most about it is that when someone's telling a story, their brain is firing off in a certain pattern and their neurons are firing a certain pattern. And the receiver of the story, the listener, their brain mirrors the person telling the story's brain and also fires off in the same pattern, which is called neural coupling. And it's really incredible to think that our brains are literally programmed to receive stories in such an impactful way. So that's a neuroscience. And how do you actually use that? So things like paying attention to how you're describing things within a story. So you want to be using descriptors for movement, which fires off the motor sensors in the brain. You want to use descriptors for how something feels, which fires off the sensory descriptors in the brain. When you're talking about going somewhere, bringing in the language of the movement, not just saying, and then I went here, say I walked quickly to the networking event, for example. So it's really bringing in, I mean, to a degree, we don't want to go too over the top and flowery, but bringing in as much descriptors to create an image within the brain of what is happening. And that's what builds the sense of, I can imagine myself there. I'm brought into this story.
Wow. Okay, so painting a picture when we are telling a story. Great. So it seems like this is from the old ages when we used to live in caves and sit around the campfire and tell stories. Okay, you need to avoid dinosaurs, and that's where brain neurons fire up, and you know that okay, this is something you need to avoid, or this is something you need to do.
Exactly that. And that is a really good creation of why this is important. And you just told a story in that we can imagine ourselves sat around a campfire discussing the dinosaur encounter that we had. I don't know if that's actually accurate with when we were around with the dinosaurs, but let's just imagine that it was. And or maybe like a saber-toothed tiger or whatever. And we're telling the story of what happened and how we escaped. And we're really creating that sense of like on the edge of our seat. okay, I want to know what happens next. We will remember that when it comes to the point of going out there and going hunting ourselves and how to avoid getting in the same situation with a giant creature that might eat us.
Well, okay, okay. Let's bring us back to the business world of today. How businesses can uh, effectively use storytelling, and how they can effectively use their values and communicate their values in their brand narrative. How do we do that?
So, when you're creating your overarching business or brand story, your values and your purpose are really what drives that story. So, it's not so much about it's it's the fabric of the story that communicates your values. So, for example, the Electric Peaches story is that we were born from the belief that marketing and advertising could be a force for good. And our story is all about frustration at the status quo of how marketing agencies are and how the marketing industry is, how it's been used to manipulate people to buy things they don't need, the impact that has on the environment, the impact that has on people's happiness. And our story is all about finding a solution to that through impact driven ethical marketing. And that's the story. So you can tell already through that our values are around inclusivity and genuine connection and authenticity and ethical business practice. And I don't really have to say that those are our values, because the story itself shows through the status quo and why we found that problematic, the conflict and why that occurred to us as being something we wanted to change, and the resolution being how we're going to change it. So your values don't need to be said explicitly, but they're
Like,
implicit in everything that you're doing through storytelling.
great. So implicitly convey what your values are and what you stand for as a business. How do you mentioned authenticity as one of the values? How do you think it plays a role in creating a meaningful connection with the audience?
I think authenticity, we know when businesses are being inauthentic. Especially because nowadays everyone's jumping on the purpose bandwagon, and you look beneath the surface and go, well, I don't know, like you're a massive polluter, or I know that you use slave labor in your supply chain. So your purpose is really not resonating as something that's authentic. You're just jumping on this wagon. People and consumers are getting so smart to this. And again, to go back to psychology, we have an innate knowing when we're being lied to. And businesses who are employing manipulative tactics and trying to convince audiences that they're doing something that they're clearly not, actually now are having such a huge backlash from that. It's so much more impactful when the story is, this is what we want to achieve, this is where we have been, and these are the steps we've taken to get to a better outcome, but we're not there yet because these are the obstacles in our way. This is what we're doing to try to move through that. And even though it might not seem like it's as impressive as a story as the we're changing the world purpose narrative, it's authentic and far more relatable and far more inspiring, because a lot of human beings and our stories aren't finite. They're often about the experience and the journey and the lessons that we learn along the way. And for me, that's where businesses can really lean into talking about some of their failures and using that as something that is really going to give them a great, it's going to build their audience's trust in them. And that's why authenticity is so important in this, because it comes back to trust. And when you lose trust of your audiences, then that's pretty much game over for your business.
Wow, great, great. Could you share some personal stories of brands that have successfully used storytelling to build
Sure.
emotional connection with the customers?
Sure. So when you say personal, do you mean work we have done at Electric Peach?
work you have done in electric pitch, or some notable examples that are out there and that everybody could look into?
So everyone will have heard of or know or be aware of Dove and Dove's campaigns around real beauty. It's a really good example of storytelling in action because they've got their overarching narrative, their overarching story, which is around the importance of real beauty. And then each of their campaigns have a sort of stream or like a separate story that fits into that overarching narrative. So you've got a recent one that they did around the problem with social media and the impact that's having on young girls' self-image. You've got another one that's around body positivity, another one that's around skin and how we see ourselves. And all of them use real people. All of them use really relatable concepts that their audiences are worried about at the moment or are engaging in a wider conversation about at the moment. They're all very emotional. Like some of them are really difficult to watch because they're so raw and emotional. And they're all feeding into this bigger narrative around the importance of real beauty. And it's kind of almost that you forget that Dove is literally just making deodorants and like soap. Like, with all due respect to Dove, it's nothing particularly groundbreaking or even particularly exciting. But their brand storytelling makes them extremely engaging and moves people to share the stories beyond, like, you wouldn't share a deodorant ad. Like, why would you? But you will share an ad that's about something that you can resonate with or that you've been concerned about within your own life.
Right. Businesses can use our case studies and tell stories with those case studies and make sure those stories align with a brand narrative that we have.
Yeah, exactly that. So when we're creating the brand narrative or campaign narrative for our clients, we always start with the audience because they are the stars of your story, not you. They are the heroes of the story. So in order for them to feel like they're the hero of the story, we need to understand what it is that they are dealing with in their own lives. What is the struggle that they're going through right now? How can the brand provide that resolution or that solution? How do we speak in their language? How do we make them feel seen and understood in a really short amount of time? And that's why the Dove campaigns do such a great job because they've really tapped into the zeitgeist of the collective feeling, especially amongst women, of the beauty standards being totally messed up or social media having a huge impact in self belief and how we believe ourselves to look. They've tapped into that, and that has what's made them so impactful.
In your experience, what key elements make a brand story memorable and shareable in today's digital age?
So, the structure of a good story and any good story is status quo. So, how things are, what's happening in the world of the story. Conflict. Every single good story has to have a conflict because all stories at their root are about overcoming conflict or overcoming adversity. So it has to be a conflict and then there has to be a resolution. So what makes them really impactful and memorable, and to go back to what I was saying about Dove, is to really understand where the challenges of the status quo are for people, that for your audiences, really understand the general themes of conflict that they are experiencing, and then what the resolution to that is that's related to your brand. So I'm not talking about like random things that are completely like unrelated. It has to be something that your brand delivers on within the resolution. But the most important part of it really is to understand what your audiences are dealing with and be able to talk to their challenges through your stories in a way that helps them to feel really seen by your business.
Fantastic. I love this status quo conflict resolution framework.
you might have heard of the hero's journey, which is a
Yeah.
much wider framework for storytelling. But really, the hero's journey is basically status quo, conflict resolution, another conflict and another resolution, a few people coming in to give advice, and then the final resolution. So it's a brilliant framework, but it's a lot more complicated. So just thinking about it as those three steps makes it a lot easier to implement.
What challenges do you see for brands in maintaining a consistent and compelling narrative?
I think the challenge that I see is not understanding what the overarching narrative really is and giving the time to that, which requires a lot of audience research, a lot of listening to your audiences and understanding where they're at. Um, and also making sure that you're being that you're always talking back into that overarching story. When we talk about brand storytelling, it really needs to be looked at as a big picture, holistic process. It can't just be like one thing here over there on one social media platform and another thing over here. Everything needs to tie in together, and every single touch point builds the story out more. It's not something that many brands get right, to be honest with you. I saw in London on Tuesday a giant installation from American Airlines, which totally missed the point of storytelling. It was basically just like, there's a story, it's a never ending story, and it has lots of characters, and there's ice cream, and there's more character. And it wasn't telling a story at all. It was just telling the sort of components of a story and leaving everybody very confused afterwards. Like, what's the point in this? So even massive brands get it completely wrong because they've missed the point of what actually a story is.
Great. Okay, this gives us a good explanation why storytelling should be used. And how do you actually craft a brand story out of all the information that you have about your brand and your business, or you don't have? How do you approach that? How you create it?
So again, using that framework of what is the status quo? What is the way things are now? And why is that problematic? What needs to change? What is the conflict? And how is that having an impact? What are the emotional resonance within that conflict? Why is that really, what's at the root of it? Underneath everything that we might assume is going on. And then from there, we can understand, okay, this is the story that's going to most resonate. I don't want to give too much away about it because that's like it's our process, but it always starts with a huge piece of audience research. And this is another thing that I see businesses skipping, this essential part of the process, and then wondering why their stories aren't resonating. Because the best stories are coming from your audience. So not only does doing your audience research give you the color within the story framework, it's what builds out the narrative and builds out the visuals of the narrative, if you think of it as visuals in a more in your brain sense. But also it helps you to understand the stories of your audiences, because really their stories are what are most interesting about building out your brand narrative. So maybe I need to backtrack a little bit in case I'm confusing you. So the first thing to do before you start thinking about building out stories is to get clear on your brand identity, which is what a lot of people don't do. So we work on brand development first. Within the brand development, we look at what is the narrative of the brand, what is the story that we're telling, why is that important, why does anyone care, why do we care, as in why does the brand care. All of this builds out the smaller narratives that we then create. Then we do the audience research. So why are they buying from this business in the first place, or other businesses like them? What is it that they're being driven by? What is the challenges that they're facing in relation to this business? And how can we offer them a solution in a way that is talking directly to that challenge?
Fantastic. In other words, we start with who are we, who's sitting around the campfire, and
Yes.
where's the dinosaur?
Yeah, exactly. And who's afraid of tomorrow when they're going to go out to the dinosaur, and what do they need to know about the situation with the dinosaur?
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Nice. Now, uh, with the rise of short form video on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts, potentially other platforms, how can a brand effectively communicate our story in a concise and impactful way within the mere seconds that we have to reach that customer?
There's so many different ways that we can tell stories. We could tell our founder stories, and that's us talking about our own challenges and resolutions that we found along the way. If we're using video, then there's ways to do that that make it more engaging. Or we could just talk to the video and tell our audiences our own story through our own us to the camera. There are so many on TikTok brilliant creators who use storytelling so well because and again, thinking about the narrative, like what's the beginning, middle, and end? What do you want your audience to take away from this story? What's the point of it? Why should they care? Why do you care? Who are you talking to? All of these different things to consider before you even start building out a script or before you start recording. But every single brilliant creator on any social platform is phenomenal at telling stories because they're talking again to an emotion, to a feeling that they know that their audience has. One guy who comes up to me for me when I think about this is Rob Mayhew, who does a lot of parodies of what it's like working in a creative agency. And his stories are brilliant because they're like little snapshots of in a meeting with in a creative agency or being briefed as a designer who works at a creative agency. And what they're all doing as one big collective of stories is showing how toxic agency cultures are. But what each different snapshot of that is saying, well, it's very relatable, but it's also very amusing. And so each different one has its own point, but when they put together, they create an even wider point. And that's really the best way to use short form content, is to think, how many different ways can I tell this story in a way that's engaging? If you're using something like TikTok, then preferably also funny, makes people think, gets people to go like, oh my God, yes, like that's exactly what I think. This is exactly what I've been thinking. How did you know? And he's definitely one to look at if you want some inspiration of how to do that well.
Or can we put our stories, our narrative in the context of trends that are out there?
Yeah, of course. One of the kind of most impactful ways of using storytelling is to tell human stories. So stories of us, the founders, stories of, if we have teams, stories of our team, our clients, our, if you're a B2C, your customers, all of these different ways to tell. There are so many different ways to tell a story, but the most impactful is always going to be where there's a human in there. Again, to go back to the storytelling framework, is there has to be a main character in every story. Otherwise, it's not really a story. And it's not that exciting if the main character is a business. It has to be a
Mm.
human being.
When talking about selling the experience and not the product, it relates to the emotion part of storytelling, in my understanding. And I remember a notable example here is Apple
Yes,
and
Apple's a
their
really good
products
example.
and
So
the iPod, for example, and how Steve Jobs presented the iPod like music in your pocket, 1,000 songs in your pocket, and not this is a product that you can use to listen to music.
Exactly. And you know, a fun story about Steve Jobs is that Apple was totally having no impact whatsoever. And then he went away for a while, went to work for Pixar, learned the framework of impactful stories, came back and started to tell the story of the emotion behind the product or the desire behind the product and not the story of the product. And Apple do this so well. They've really tapped into human psychology on so many different levels. But the first part of that really was about going beyond the obvious to find the story within the story. So, for example, like you said, 1,000 or 1,000,000 songs in your pocket. It was something that was so different and new at that time that it got people's attention and was far more memorable than here's something you can play music on, which there was other things out there that you could do that with. This was something that was revolutionary, or at least it seemed to be, because of the way that they were tapping into stories and desires.
Fantastic. Can you share some more examples of brands that successfully evolved their brand storytelling from this is a product, buy it, to something more appealing and memorable?
One of my favorite small business brands is Lily. Sorry, so I'm just an annoying time. One of my favorite
You can show
small,
us the
one of
dog.
my small favorite. Sorry, my dog is, just for the viewers' interest. My dog is a rescue dog, and she's very she's got a lot of stories herself and she wants to tell them all the time. So one of my favorite brands is a brand called Snag Tights, which was set up by a woman in Scotland. So woman owned, one person business up in Scotland, and their purpose was around creating tights that were size inclusive, that were good for the environment and didn't ladder as soon as you put them on. That was what drove them. Then the story grew from there about and turned into almost a movement of self-expression through wearing different types of tights, celebration of all different body types. They brought in the burlesque community, they brought in the drag community, they tapped into communities that were vibrant and inclusive and unafraid to be self-expressed. And through getting the communities and their audiences involved in telling the story, this one person business that was developed out of Scotland has become hugely well known across the entire UK as a example of brilliant brand development.
Fascinating. Okay, get the community involved as well.
Yeah. And I think that's the key thing as well is, as I said earlier, there's many different ways to tell a story. And keeping things fresh and exciting and interesting is bringing in as many different people to help tell that story as possible. Using your audiences, using your customer experiences, you can really create a more vibrant tapestry of your story.
What can we do as individuals to improve our storytelling skills?
As individuals, to improve our storytelling, we need to become braver with our truth. Because at the heart of impactful stories from individuals is vulnerability. We, as human beings, we resonate with one another's emotional edge. And for stories to be truly impactful, they need to be okay with going to that edge. They need to express genuine emotion and experience. And that's a really hard thing to do for a lot of people, is to bring the truth of themselves and put it and lay it bare and put it out there for the world to see. the full spectrum of themselves. So it requires a lot of courage to do that. We also need to get better at listening, because really there has to be a purpose behind every story we tell. And the purpose is usually related to the audience more than it is to the person telling the story. If I was to tell you a story about some random event of a guy that I know who lives down the road and he has a dog, and every morning he and his dog go to his car, and then he drives to Tesco's, and then he does his shop, and then he goes home again. That's a story, but it's not a particularly interesting or impactful story unless you happen to be a Tesco enthusiast, in which case you'd be like, oh my God, I love Tesco's. I go there every day myself too. You know, do you know what I mean? So it's a large part of effective storytelling is our ability to listen to what people resonate with, understand what the emotion that they're looking for is, and talk to that through our own experience. Because really what makes storytelling effective is the connection between my experience, the storyteller, and your experience, the listener. We know we've got something brilliant when we can ignite a shared experience together.
Fantastic. Okay, I need to ask you, how do you help brands at Electric Peach? How do you do that?
So we help brands we do a lot of brand development work or redevelopment work. We help them first and foremost to become better at listening to their audiences. So we specialize in audience analysis and market research, and everything we do always starts with that piece of the puzzle, which so many people just ignore that part of it and just want to go straight into what they believe the story is or what they believe their audience want. But we don't do that. We start with the audience. And from that piece of research, we learn so much about what stories are resonating and what stories don't resonate. And a lot of the time it blows apart our assumptions. So we help businesses to understand their audiences better so that they can create more impactful communication and then build a dialogue between businesses and their audiences that form impactful connections, communities around brands that then grow not just the business and the profits, but also the impact that the business is making, and turn their employees and their customers into advocates so that it then has a ripple effect and more people will learn about the business. Similar to Snag Tights, more and more people buy into the vision, buy into the purpose, get excited about being part of the narrative, and grow their business through impact.
Fantastic. So much to think about. I have so many notes and so many things I want to explore further, and might have follow-up questions after that. For where can people find you and follow? How can people connect with you?
The The best place would be on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and I love to get to know people there. Also, you can find us on electricpeach.co.uk, and you can email me at sophie@electricpeach.co.uk.
That's great. Amazing. Thank you so much for doing this, Sophie. Appreciate your time today and all that information that you shared. So many interesting things. I absolutely love this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much again.